The first thing I noticed was the sound. Not footsteps, not breathing, something worse. A low, guttural clicking noise, filling the space behind us, coming from everywhere at once. It echoed off the crumbling concrete walls, reverberated through my chest like something alive, something hunting. I didn't look back, I couldn't. Ethan stumbled ahead of me, his breath coming out in short, panicked gasps. Liam was right behind him, but he wasn't running fast enough. We had to get out, had to find the exit before a violent crash. The sound of stone crumbling, of metal snapping under immense weight. Dust exploded into the air. Something massive had collapsed behind us, blocking the way we'd come, trapping us inside. Ethan turned, his face twisted with horror. Liam skidded to a stop, coughing through the dust. No way out. No, 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 no. But Liam looked up, and I followed his gaze. There, a hole in the ceiling, just big enough to squeeze through. He grabbed the edges of the rotted structure, pulling himself up first. He grunted, using every ounce of strength to haul his body through the gap. Then he reached down for me. "Ryan, come on!" I scrambled up, my fingers gripping the crumbling walls as I pushed, kicking off with everything I had. His hands closed around my wrist. We made it. We were going to live. Then I heard Ethan scream. I turned back just in time to see him struggling below, his hands clawing at the edge, his arms trembling with exhaustion. He couldn't pull himself up, and beneath him, it was coming. Something moved in the darkness, unfolding itself from the shadows. It was wrong, impossibly long, impossibly thin. I saw arms first, hooked fingers stretching toward Ethan, joints cracking in unison. Ethan tried to climb, but his foot slipped. Panic flooded his face. Liam saw it too, and he made his decision before I even realized what was happening. He looked at me, and he smiled. "You'll tell a good story about this." Then he let go. He dropped back down. He landed hard, feet slamming against the floor, and for a split second I thought, maybe he could still make it. Maybe he could climb back up, but then it moved. It didn't lunge, it didn't run, it unfolded. A shape crawled out from the darkness beneath the stairwell, stretching tall and thin, its body unnatural, its head tilting up toward Liam. It had no eyes, no face, just a smooth white surface where a human head should be. And it didn't make a sound. Liam spun toward Ethan. "Go," he ordered. Ethan crashed onto the ground beside me, gasping, shaking. His hands trembled as he clawed at the dirt, his chest rising and falling in ragged, uneven breaths. I could hear the way his throat caught, like he was trying to say something, but no words came out. I turned back. Liam was still below. He had stumbled back a few steps after throwing Ethan up, his feet scraping against the cracked floor. His arms hung loose at his sides, his breath coming sharp and quick. The thing loomed over him. It didn't move fast, it didn't need to. Its limbs unfolded slowly, unnaturally, the joints bending in places they shouldn't. Its faceless head tilted slightly, like it was considering Liam, like it was savoring the moment. "Liam!" I reached down, my arms stretching as far as I could. I knew it wasn't enough, knew he couldn't reach me, but I still tried. His head snapped up. He saw me, and he smiled. But it wasn't the cocky grin he always had, not the reckless, confident smirk that made you believe nothing could ever go wrong. This was different, smaller, almost peaceful. "Get out of here," he said. His voice was hoarse, quieter than usual, like he had already accepted something I hadn't. "No, grab my hand." I reached further, my fingers aching from how hard I was stretching. "You can still..." The thing moved. Not fast, not aggressive, but deliberate. It reached out, its spindly, bone-white fingers brushing over Liam's shoulder first. Liam flinched. Not from pain, from the cold. I saw it in his eyes, the shock, the sudden realization of what it felt like. Whatever it was, whatever that thing was made of, it wasn't alive. It wasn't anything that belonged here. Liam inhaled sharply, and for the first time, his smile faltered. I couldn't breathe. Ethan grabbed my arm, pulling me back, but I fought against him. "Liam, move!" I shouted. "Run! You have to!" Liam's legs shook beneath him. His body twitched, like he wanted to take a step back, but he didn't. He couldn't. His breath turned ragged, his chest heaving unevenly. He started, but then he gasped. The thing's fingers curled around his ribs, tightening. Liam let out a strangled noise, half a gasp, half a choke. His hands jerked up like he wanted to pry it off, but it was too strong. I saw the way his back arched, the way his fingers twitched, the way his legs stopped shaking. It was doing something to him. I reached down again, my heart slamming against my ribs. "Liam, please." His eyes locked onto mine, and he mouthed something. I didn't hear it, but I saw it. 3 words. Then the thing yanked him backward. It wasn't violent, it wasn't rushed. It was slow, controlled. It pulled him into the dark. Liam's fingers scraped against the floor, but there was no struggle. His body convulsed once, then he was gone. The silence that followed was worse than the chase, worse than the collapse, worse than everything. Ethan pulled me back again, but I couldn't move. I was still reaching for something that wasn't there anymore. "We have to go," Ethan rasped, his voice barely above a whisper. But I didn't move. I couldn't, because all I could see was the way Liam's lips had moved in those final seconds, the words he had tried to say. "I told you." The ground beneath us groaned, a warning. The walls trembled, sending dust raining from the ceiling. The same ceiling that was already half collapsed, barely holding itself together. The thing had taken Liam, but it wasn't done yet. Ethan grabbed my arm harder, jerking me back with so much force I nearly fell over. "Ryan, move!" I stumbled, but finally my body listened. We turned and ran. The building roared behind us, the groans of concrete shifting, beams snapping under their own weight. The walls shuddered, crumbling inward. We didn't stop, didn't look back. The only thing I could hear was the sound of our feet slamming against the ground, my own breath tearing through my chest. The hallway was warping. Maybe it was real, maybe it wasn't, but I felt it. The way the walls seemed to twist around us, the way the darkness stretched longer than it should have. It was still here. It was still watching. We skidded into the main hall. The rubble was there just like before, the collapse that had blocked our way out. But something was different. The hole in the ceiling, the one we had climbed through, it was smaller now, shrinking, like the building was closing in. Ethan cursed, pushing me toward it. "Go, go!" I jumped first. My fingers scraped against the crumbling edges, my arms burning from exhaustion. But I pulled myself up. I turned, immediately reaching for Ethan. He jumped. I caught his wrist, but the ceiling beneath him groaned. It was giving out. "Climb, Ethan, come on!" He struggled, his feet kicking against the wall, trying to push himself up. The rubble beneath him cracked. A sliver of blackness stretched through the shifting debris. It was coming. I tightened my grip. Ethan gasped, his other hand scrabbling at the ledge, finally finding something to hold on to. I yanked. He pulled. And just as the ground below him collapsed, just as the shadows swallowed the space where he had been, he was up. We rolled onto the floor, panting, shaking. Then silence. The collapse had settled. The dust began to thin. But I knew. We weren't safe yet. Ethan lay beside me, his chest heaving, arms shaking as he clutched the ground like he needed to convince himself it was real, that he was still here, still breathing. His mouth open, but no words came out. I didn't look at him. I couldn't. I was still staring at the hole, at the darkness beneath us where Liam had been, where he was. The silence was deafening. The building had stopped moving. The dust had settled. But I knew it wasn't over. We weren't safe. Not yet. A sound. Low, distant. Not the collapse. Not an echo. Something else. A whisper. Ethan tensed. I felt it, the way his breath caught, the way his body went rigid beside me. He heard it too. I turned my head slowly, afraid that if I moved too fast, whatever it was would notice. But the whisper wasn't coming from below. It was behind us. I didn't want to look. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to run. But I did. I turned, and I saw it. A figure, standing at the far end of the ruined hallway. Too far to make out the details, but close enough that my blood turned to ice. Ethan made a choking sound beside me, his fingers digging into my arm like a vice. "No," he whispered. "No, that..." But we both knew what we were looking at. It was Liam. Or at least, it looked like him. He stood unnaturally still, his arms limp at his sides, his posture wrong, stiff. Too stiff. But the worst part, the part that made my breath stutter in my throat, was his head, tilted just slightly, like something wasn't sitting right beneath the skin, like he was still adjusting. I opened my mouth, but no sound came out. Then he moved. Not a step, not a shift. Then he moved. Not a step, not a shift, just his head. His neck bent at an unnatural angle, almost as if the bones inside weren't quite connected the way they should be. It was subtle at first, a small jerk to the right, then another like something inside was settling, like a puppet whose strings were still being tightened. Ethan's breathing hitched beside me. I could feel the way his body tensed, his muscles locking up as if moving would make it real. But it was real. Liam, or the thing that looked like Liam, was standing there, facing us, unmoving again, except for his fingers. They twitched, not in a natural way, not like someone flexing their hand after waking up. It was mechanical, deliberate, one finger at a time, slow, too precise. Then his shoulders rose like he was inhaling. But there was no sound, no breath, nothing. He took a step. I flinched. Ethan grabbed my arm, his fingers digging into my sleeve. "Ryan," he whispered, barely audible. "That's not him." I didn't respond, because I knew, but I couldn't look away. Liam, or whatever was left of him, tilted his head again, just slightly, like he was trying to understand something. His lips parted, not to speak, just open, like someone who had forgotten how to move their own mouth. And then he smiled. A slow, stretching grin that looked almost human, almost normal, if you didn't notice how his lips didn't quite match the movement of his face, how his eyes, his empty, hollow eyes, didn't blink, didn't shift. Ethan sucked in a sharp breath beside me. I felt my stomach churn. Liam took another step. I stumbled back, my hands clenching into fists at my sides, my pulse thundering in my ears. This wasn't real. This wasn't real. But it was, because he kept moving. One step, then another, closer. Ethan pulled at my sleeve, his voice tighter now, urgent. "Ryan, we have to go." But I couldn't move. I was frozen, watching. Because as Liam walked, his movements became smoother, less awkward, less unnatural, more like him. But it wasn't him. I knew that. I knew that. But it looked like him, enough to make my chest ache, enough to make my breath shudder. Then he spoke. "You left me." It was his voice, his exact voice, but wrong. Like a recording played back at the wrong speed. Too crisp, too clear. Ethan flinched. No, Liam's head twitched. His lips curled into something that wasn't quite a frown. "You left me," he repeated. It wasn't an accusation. It wasn't angry. It was a fact, stated plainly. His fingers flexed again, curling into his palms before stretching outward. Ethan grabbed my arm harder, yanking me backward. "Ryan, now!" But I couldn't stop staring. Because something was happening. Liam's skin, it was shifting. Not visibly, not like something crawling beneath it, but subtly. Too smooth in some places, too stretched in others. Like the idea of a human rather than an actual person. A close imitation, but not perfect. I swallowed hard, my throat dry. "Liam," I whispered. His head jerked up at that, like it was the first time he had really heard me. His mouth twitched. Then he smiled again, and it was perfect, flawless. "Come back," he said. His tone was soft, gentle, familiar, but I couldn't move. Ethan did. He pulled me so hard I nearly fell, my feet stumbling over loose debris. "Run," he hissed. And this time, I did. We tore through the wreckage, ducking beneath fallen beams, slipping over broken stone. I didn't look back, but I felt it. The weight of his presence, the sound of his voice. Too close. "Ryan," it called. Not loud, not aggressive, but persistent, patient. Ethan was dragging me at this point, his grip bruising. My head spun, my lungs burned, but I kept moving. We burst through what was left of the entrance, stumbling into the open night air. But we didn't stop, not until we reached the trees. Not until the only thing around us was the sound of wind and our own gasping breaths. I bent over, pressing my hands to my knees, trying to force air into my chest. Ethan leaned against a tree, his face pale, sweat dripping down his temple. We said nothing. The silence stretched. Then finally, Ethan swallowed hard, his voice barely above a whisper. "That wasn't him." I nodded, unable to speak, because we both knew. Whatever was in that building, whatever had taken him, it had let us leave. But it wasn't done with us yet. Ethan's voice was barely above a whisper, but it carried the weight of something neither of us wanted to accept. "That wasn't him." I nodded, swallowing hard. My throat was dry, raw from running, from breathing in dust and fear. But my mind wouldn't stop spinning, because he had looked like Liam. He had sounded like Liam. But it wasn't him. It couldn't have been. Ethan wiped his face with the back of his sleeve, his hand still shaking. I could see the raw terror in his eyes, the way his mind was racing just as fast as mine. We didn't speak for a long time. We just stood there, the forest stretching out around us, the wind rustling through the trees, carrying the weight of everything we had just run from. But then something else moved. Not behind us, not from the wreckage, from ahead, in the trees. A shadow flickered between the branches, just barely visible in the darkness. We both saw it. Ethan's breath hitched. I grabbed his arm, forcing myself to stay still, to think. But then, a whisper, low, distant, not Liam's voice, something else. Ethan tensed beside me. I took a slow, careful step back. It didn't follow. It didn't move closer. But it was there, waiting. And I understood. This wasn't over. It would never be over. Not really. Not after what we had seen. Not after what had seen us. The weight of it settled in my chest like lead. I turned to Ethan, my pulse hammering in my skull. "We can't stay here," I said, my voice barely steady. Ethan just nodded. We ran again. This time, we didn't stop until we reached the gas station. The fluorescent lights buzzed above us, humming softly, filling the silence with something almost normal, almost safe. But it wasn't. Not really. Because as I stood there, hands braced against the counter, lungs burning, mind still catching up to everything that had just happened, I felt it. That same weight, that same presence, watching, waiting. Ethan collapsed onto one of the plastic chairs, dropping his head into his hands. Neither of us spoke. There was nothing left to say, because we both knew the truth. We had left that place, but it hadn't left us. It never would. Liam had been searching for something his whole life, an escape, a thrill, a way to outrun whatever haunted him when he was home. He found it. But the cost was too high. And now we had to live with it. We had to carry it. No one would ever believe us. But that didn't change what we knew, what we had seen, what was still out there, waiting. I don't know if it will ever come back. I don't know if it will ever let us go. But if you're listening, if you ever feel that pull, that need to go somewhere you shouldn't, to find something no one else has, don't. Some things aren't meant to be found. Some places don't want you to leave. And some things aren't done once you walk away. So tell me, what would you have done?